All right, so you are not tuned in on the Youth Ministry YouTube channel. You are tuned in here on the Brentwood Oaks channel, and this is the adult Bible class for Sunday, January 17th. Now, I know what you're thinking. James, you're the youth minister, and you would be correct. I am. In fact, I don't think, I've taught a parenting class before, and I did a podcast interview discussion thing with the home builders a couple years ago, but I have, outside of those two things, never actually taught an adult Bible class like this. Never done it. So that means that I'm coming into this with zero context. I don't know that I've ever even sat in an adult Bible class before. My life has been teaching kids. And so I've actually done a full series. I'm almost done with it with the youth on the Gospel of Luke. And so we've talked about a lot of these stories before. So as we go through this, you're welcome to go back and check out our other videos on our youth YouTube channel. It's The Rock YM. Just search for that on YouTube. And there's great stuff there. Well, I say great stuff, but you know. So today, as we start this section of the Gospel of Luke, looking at partway through chapter 4 to the end of chapter 5, I just really want us to highlight a couple of things and then move forward. Now, this section of the Gospel of Luke really has a lot to do with Jesus' disciples beginning to see who he really is. Now, at the beginning of chapter 4, Jesus is tempted in the desert, and so he spends this time alone and away. And as he comes back, his disciples begin to get this view of who he is. Look at Luke chapter 4, starting in verse 14. It says, Jesus returned to Galilee in the power of the Spirit, and news about him spread through the whole countryside. He was teaching in their synagogues, and everyone praised him. So Jesus comes back from the desert, and he begins to teach in the synagogues, and people just really begin to see who he is, including his own disciples. And he goes into the synagogue and he teaches on the Sabbath, and there's this big thing that happens here, but really I want us to look at just the overall picture. He goes in and he teaches in his hometown. They say, "No thanks. You're the carpenter's kid, right? Like you're not this big amazing teacher. You grew up here." Maybe you've experienced that type of thing before, where you go home and people just see you as that knucklehead kid who grew up there instead of the person you've actually become. And I wonder if Jesus is facing some of that same challenge here in this passage. He goes into the synagogue, teaches these powerful things, and they look at him and go, no, don't think so. In fact, Jesus says later in verse 24, he says, "Truly I tell you, no prophet is accepted in his hometown." He says it's impossible. We have these preconceived ideas about people, and we have these notions of who we think they are, even if that's not really and truly the case. But his disciples see that amazing teaching. Well, not only does Jesus come back from the desert and begin to teach, but then look at what happens in verse 31. In verse 31, it says he goes down to Capernaum, and on the Sabbath he taught the people. Verse 32, they were amazed at his teaching because his words had authority. So not only has Jesus come in and he's begun to teach, but he's not just teaching in a normal way. He's not just your average Bible teacher. No, he teaches as one who had authority. Like he has the ability to speak into this in a way that nobody else does. If you are an authority on something, when you speak on it, then it carries weight. And when Jesus begins to teach in the synagogues, these people hear him and realize he knows what he's talking about. He has this authority to really speak into the situation. And so while he's doing that, there is someone who comes up who is possessed by a demon. It says he cries out in a loud voice in verse 34, "Go away. What do you want with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." So as Jesus is teaching and these people are starting to soak it up, this demon-possessed man shows up and starts to disrupt the scene. It's probably no coincidence that this happens. As Jesus is showing this authority, doesn't it make sense that Satan would want to disrupt that moment? And so he sends this man full of demons comes in and says, "Get out of here. What do you want? Why are you here?" Verse 35, it says, "Be quiet," Jesus said sternly, "come out of him." And then the demon threw the man down before them all and came out without injuring him. Now, as an aside, I just want to throw this in for free. If you haven't started watching the series The Chosen, you can watch it for free on YouTube. I'm not a big fan of like Bible movies or shows. I'm a fan of the content. I'm just not a fan of the style most of the time. But what I found in watching a few episodes of The Chosen is I really like the way they tell the story. And so they, in the first episode, it shows Nicodemus going to try and drive an evil spirit out of Mary. It ends up being Mary Magdalene. And it shows her in the midst of being controlled by a demon. And so if you want to get a good idea and a good picture of what this looks like, I'd say go check that out. In fact, just go check them out. I'll try to link below. That's what the kids do. This demon shows up. Jesus, teaching with authority, now has that authority challenged. And when this evil spirit challenges Jesus and his authority, Jesus says, "No." He says, "Be quiet, come out of him." And the spirit leaves. Now, if this is a way that Satan is trying to challenge Jesus and his authority, then Jesus answers with a resounding yes. Like, this is who I am. I am the Son of God. I have the power and the authority to do what needs to be done. In fact, it says in verse 36, all the people were amazed and said to each other, "What words these are! With authority and power he gives orders to impure spirits, and they come out." And the news about him spread throughout the surrounding area. All right, so Jesus goes away, is tempted, then comes back, teaches in his hometown, is somewhat rejected because he's a local boy, but his teaching still has power and authority. In fact, as he goes to Capernaum, it shows up again, and there is great power here, great authority, and so much so that this demon shows up to challenge Jesus, obviously will rise to this challenge and drive out the demon. So people not only are hearing his words that carry the authority and the power of being the Son of God, but he also shows the power to drive out demons, something that was not a common thing. He's beginning to reveal more and more about who he is. Well, after that, he's got this follower named Simon. We know him as Peter. Peter was married, and his mother-in-law is sick. In fact, it says that she has a high fever, and they ask Jesus for his help. And in verse 39, it says, so Jesus bends over and rebukes the fever, and it left her. She got up at once and began to wait on them. Now, I just found that interesting that Jesus rebukes the fever. You know, a lot of times when I think about Jesus rebuking someone, it's someone who's caught in the wrong, or maybe like in the previous passage where Jesus drives out the demons. I think about Jesus rebuking in that way. But here, he rebukes the fever. He says, no, this is not how this is supposed to be. And it leaves her. Incredible. Who else but Jesus has this power? So, there's been teaching with authority. there's been the authority over the demons, and now authority over sickness. In fact, it says after that, in verse 40, it says, "At sunset, the people brought to Jesus all who had various kinds of sickness, and laying his hands on each one, he healed them. Moreover, demons came out of many people, shouting, 'You are the Son of God.' But he rebuked them and would not allow them to speak because they knew he was the Messiah." So Jesus heals all these people. He drives out the demons, and then he rebukes this fever, and word spreads. Because if you have someone around who is able to heal in that way, you're going to tell people about it. You know, we are so very blessed and fortunate to have all the doctors and nurses and medical technologies and now vaccines and things that are able to help us in dealing with illness. Jesus, in his day, none of those things, they had doctors, but it was not the same. And so for Jesus to be on the scene and to be healing anything and everything, from a fever to demons and everything in between, people jump at the chance. They want to be healed. They want healing to come in their life. And so Jesus does that. He provides that for them. Not only is he a teacher with authority, but he's a healer with authority. There is nothing too big or too small for Jesus to bring his power and authority to when it comes to healing. Look at what it says, though, in verse 42. "At daybreak, Jesus went out to a solitary place. The people were looking for him, and when they came to where he was, they tried to keep him from leaving them. But he said, 'I must proclaim the good news of the kingdom of God to the other towns also, because that is why I was sent.' And he kept on preaching in the synagogues of Judea." So as Jesus continues to reveal himself, and he has all these people come to him, and he's healing all night long, he goes and he finds a solitary place. And so I think for me, when I read this, it's a challenge for me to think, how am I taking care of myself spiritually? How am I being effective at doing the work I was called to do if I'm not taking care of myself? And so maybe you're in the same boat, that through all this time of COVID and all this, you may have struggled in finding your place and finding a source of strength and healing. Even Jesus, after all this teaching and all this healing that he does, he goes to find that time of rest with the Father. I hope that you and I will do the same, that we will be people who look for those opportunities to find rest. And when he comes back, they want to keep him there in that region. They want to keep him where he's at, but he's got work to do. And so not only do we need to follow in Jesus' steps, well, we need to follow in Jesus' steps and everything, but in finding that bit of rest with the Father and refreshment, but we also need to have that clear sense of purpose. In verse 43, he says, "I must proclaim the good news of the kingdom of God to the other towns also, because that is why I was sent." I was sent, Jesus says, to preach the good news, to speak into these the lives of all the people around here, to let them know the good news. And so do we have that same clear point of purpose? Jesus continues to reveal himself to his disciples, to these people who are following him. At the beginning of chapter 5, he calls disciples, these people that may have been following him and seeing these things happening, and maybe some people who hadn't. And so he goes and he calls Peter and Andrew and James and John, and he does this incredible thing in order to help them see who he is, and he delivers this incredible catch of fish. And I think what's really cool about this, as we think about being people who have followed Jesus, I think about what happens here. It says in verse 11, it says, "So they pulled their boats up on shore, left everything, and followed him." Jesus provides this miraculous catch. This catch would have been worth a ton of money. And yet, Peter, Andrew, James, and John all see this and realize that they are going to follow Jesus because what he gave them was valuable, but what he will continue to give them is worth more. The boats, the fish, all this stuff, while extremely valuable, pales in comparison to what Jesus offers as far as what they would receive in following him. Incredible. Well, that gets us to Luke chapter 5 and verse 12. And I want us to spend the rest of our time here this morning in this story because I think it's interesting and I think it's valuable for us today. So I want to go ahead and read this passage, and then I want us to stop for a minute and talk about it. Luke chapter 5, starting in verse 12, it says this: "While Jesus was in one of the towns, a man came along who was covered with leprosy. When he saw Jesus, he fell with his face to the ground and begged him, 'Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean.' Jesus reached out his hand and touched the man. 'I am willing,' he said, 'be clean.' And immediately the leprosy left him. Then Jesus ordered him, 'Don't tell anyone, but go show yourself to the priests and offer the sacrifices that Moses commanded for your cleansing as a testimony to them.' Yet the news about him spread all the more, so that crowds of people came to hear him and to be healed of their sicknesses. But Jesus often withdrew in lonely places and prayed." So we have other accounts in the Gospels of Jesus healing someone with leprosy. But one of the interesting things here, I think, is the whole situation. This guy is outside the city because he wouldn't have been allowed in with leprosy. And as he sees Jesus coming into the city, he then calls out or makes eye contact, or we're not really sure how it happens. But when he sees Jesus, he falls on his face and he says, "Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean." Now, one of the interesting things about this story is I think that question is kind of the inverse or kind of the opposite of what happens in John chapter 5 when Jesus heals the man who's paralyzed at the pool of Bethesda. Jesus asks, "Do you want to get well? Do you want me to heal you? Do you want me to do what I can do?" Now, maybe there's some other reasons that Jesus asks that. It's him sitting at the pool and all that. But this seems like this man is asking the question of Jesus. Instead of Jesus asking the question of him, he asks it of Jesus. "Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean." There's so much more faith in that question than there is in John chapter 5 and the man at the pool. The man at the pool, when Jesus says, "Do you want to get well?" the guy goes, "Well, I can't get in the pool whenever it's stirred by the angels, and I'm never the first one in at that point." And Jesus is like, "Well, wait a minute. You must be missing what I'm saying to you. You must be missing what is happening here." In this story, before Jesus can do any of that, this man says, "Lord, if you're willing, you can make me clean." And so Jesus does what Jesus is going to do. He reaches out and touches this person. We skip over that so often, not thinking about the implications of what Jesus has just done. When he reaches out his hand and touches this man with leprosy, what he's doing is making himself unclean. He is making himself ritually unclean, meaning Jesus will now have to go to the temple and be cleansed and go through the process and the rituals necessary to do that. He reaches out, touches, and tells him, "I am willing." Now, Jesus could have just said, "I'm willing, be healed, be clean." and have the leprosy leave him. But I think Jesus is always so intentional about what he does. Just like he will bear sin, the sin of the world, when he is crucified on the cross and become unclean so that we might become clean. Here, Jesus makes himself unclean so that this man will be made clean. Such a powerful moment. I also love the personal connection here, that as Jesus touches, it's not only does he make himself unclean in order to make this man clean, but he's also restoring to him this sense of humanity. Someone who hasn't been touched in a long time, someone who hasn't had a hand on their shoulder, someone who hasn't been hugged. Now Jesus rehumanifies them. I don't know if that's a word, but he brings humanity back to this person. He brings back that humanity of him being touched. Isn't that just the way that Jesus is? That not only does he go out of his way to make us clean, not only does he go the extra mile, but he also he does those things in order to show us love and compassion in ways that we can't imagine. I don't know about you, but there have been so many times in my life where I could have done just the bare minimum, and I did the bare minimum to help someone. But those don't stand out nearly as much as those times that I have gone above and beyond. Or when someone has done that for me, I remember those times better than the times that someone has done something just to scrape by. Jesus does this incredible thing for this man. He continues on this trend of revealing himself and really establishing his ministry in chapter 5. He heals a paralyzed man, and it's the friends who lower their paralyzed friend through the roof. Such an amazing and powerful story. We don't have time to talk about all the intricacies of that and what happens in that moment, but the forgiveness of sins that Jesus offers, it's that next step, right? It's not just that physical healing or the restoring of humanity that he brings to the situation, but it's the forgiveness of sins that only God provides. And then he does something that nobody expects. I don't know if anybody has been expecting him to bring the healing that he brings, but then he actually calls a tax collector to follow him. He asks Levi, the disciple we know as Matthew, to follow him. Levi, a tax collector. Once again, I'm recommending The Chosen, and it talks about Matthew's story. You really need to go and check this out. But Jesus asks this tax collector. It's very vague. Look at verse 27. After this, Jesus went out and saw a tax collector by the name of Levi sitting at his tax booth. "Follow me," Jesus said to him. And Levi got up, left everything, and followed him. It's so vague in this story, and I want more, and The Chosen kind of helps explain that and give it perspective. But for Jesus to approach a tax collector and ask him to follow a rabbi, this is a huge honor and a huge deal. And tax collectors are so hated in this culture because not only are they working with the Romans, but they are cheating and lying scoundrels. And Jesus calls that person to follow him. And if Jesus can call a tax collector, a sinner, to follow him, there's room for you and I in the kingdom. And that, friends, is great news. When the Pharisees question him about eating at Matthew's house and hanging out with all these sinners, Jesus says this profound thing in verse 31. "It is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners to repentance." What wonderful words from Jesus to remind us that there are people who desperately need the grace and the mercy and the salvation that only comes from him. Well, that's Luke chapter 4 and 5. Next week we'll pick up and look at Luke 6 and 7. And I hope that this has been helpful to you. I hope it's been an enjoyable thing. And like I said, been teaching through Luke for a while now. And if you want to see a different style of teaching, you're always welcome to go and check those out. They're not just for kids. They can also be for you. I pray that the words of Jesus and the actions of Jesus as he continues to reveal himself to the people and begin this ministry, I hope that it hits you today where you need to be hit. I hope it helps you think about where you are and what you need to be doing as a follower of Jesus. Thanks for hanging with me today. My hope and my prayer is that we continue to enjoy the gospel together over the next couple of weeks, and I hope that you have a blessed week. See you next week.